Hello and welcome to another edition of the E-commerce Odyssey podcast. I'm here with Shawn O'Neill from SpeedSense, and we're going to talk about why it's so hard for e-commerce brands to run a fast website. So Shawn, my first question to you is, why is website speed important?
Hey, Trevor. Thanks for having me. Website speed is important for a lot of different reasons. Let's slice it into, we'll say, 3 or 4 categories. One is like the on-site interaction of the user. So, UX, bounce rate, conversion rate, everything around the user and the customer on your site. The second, I guess, would be like the SEO facet, where, Google's been very straightforward of late that a faster website is going to contribute better to your SEO rank. So the core web vitals metrics, we can talk a lot more about that. Influence site rank, search rank. Another big contributing factor, I guess, to why I feel like site speed is important is the carbon output of the servers that are powering the site, the network. There's a carbon impact of running a website in general, and so one of our values is the triple bottom line planetary side of things. And then finally, if you're running ads. Or not finally, there's many aspects, and I could keep going on this for a while, but return on ad spend is a big one. So if you've got, would you rather send $1 million worth of ad traffic to a site that loads in 5 seconds or a site that loads in 1? I think the bounce rate math is pretty straightforward and very convincing that you'd much rather have a quicker experience for that ROAS to being higher.
Okay.
So tons of data there.
How does a company know if that site speed is important for them? Or they have a problem? So
sure.
First, how do they know they've got a problem, and how do they measure that problem?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a lot of ways to measure web performance, and luckily over the last couple of years, maybe 18 months to 2 years, Google has done a good job of aggregating. They've built a database that basically aggregates all the page views on all the sites across the world as you're clicking through in Chrome, and reports that back to Google. And they can highlight this data in your Search Console, in Page Speed Insights scan, and they use this to influence search rank, like I just mentioned a second ago. So this is a publicly available data set. The easiest way to determine if you have a site speed issue, though, to answer that question in short, is type "what is my website speed" into Google and find the first couple of hits and pop your homepage in there, and then run a scan. The challenging part there is you've only scanned your homepage. And if you're a brand with thousands or tens of thousands of URLs, because you've got a lot of catalogs and products and articles and everything else, then you've only scanned one page, and it may not be the most or worst performant. It may not even be very relevant, depending on how you run your business. Your homepage likely isn't the most frequently visited template, we'll say. Especially in e-commerce, often the product detail pages are least performant and most visited. So that helps identify whether you have a site speed issue.
But Chili, if you've got like a score, so if you go into Lightning, is it the Lightning speed?
Lighthouse, yeah.
Lighthouse, that's one, sorry. Yeah. So if you've got an e-commerce site, the sites are quite big, they've got a lot going on, they will naturally have a lower speed than a single page, which has got, no graphics on it and how do you know, should you be looking at how should you benchmark your site?
Sure. Yeah. I talk a lot about you don't need to be the fastest site on the internet, and the user experience of Craigslist is not the most engaging, though that would be certainly the fastest way to build a site. So there's 2 things you just touched on there. When you run a page speed insight scan, pagespeed.web.dev is the URL for anybody listening along. You can pop in your domain there, and it gives you 2 types of data. And generally there are 2 categories of performance data. One is real user metrics, or RUM, as in the wild. And the other is synthetic data, or in the lab, we'll say. So the synthetic tests are the ones that, a bot loads the page, deconstructs all the DOM elements, tracks all the metrics as the page is loading. And that is what generates your score. So that 90% or 100% or 40%, whatever your page is scoring, is generated synthetically. And those are usually using a throttled connection, a device, because if you can make the experience fast on a slow phone on a slow network, it's going to be good for most people, as long as you're delivering the same experience everywhere. So the score is one thing to look at, but it's not sort of the be all end all. You could be delivering a good experience with the score in the 70s or 80s, because those two are correlated, but not directly. Like there's no direct correlation between that like 75% score and your Google search rank, for example. They're of course measuring the same thing in different ways, but the two aren't directly correlated. Maybe I'm a bit too low level in the math right now.
So if you have a situation, if to what extent is the rank you have on Google Natural Search and your paid speeds linked? Because we recently on my website managed to make an enormous improvement in the core vitals, and we improved our ranking speed enormously, but it didn't really seem to make an awful lot of difference to our natural search traffic. I mean, have you seen what is the relationship?
Like most things SEO, we're told there is a relationship, and we're building some models with clients that we have to quantify that relationship. I'm not going to have a super concise answer here, other than it depends, of course, as any consultant would say. It depends on your industry and your competition. If you've got a really clear landing page that hits exactly for a certain query, but you're ranking low and your site is slow, then there's an opportunity. But just like, to what extent does copywriting contribute? It's one factor that Google has said is contributing to SEO rank, but the quantum is TBD.
So how important is it to pass the core web vitals for both mobile and desktop?
How important? It depends on your page and your industry. Sorry again for it depends. It's the core web vitals have been chosen specifically out of hundreds of other possible metrics because they represent a good user experience. And so the three metrics sort of represent, can I see what's happening? Like, am I getting the experience that I want in that the page is loading? Is it responding quickly? Like when I touch the glass or click the button, is it coming back with a response in short order? And third is the visual presentation stable? Like, are things moving around a lot? And so those are the three core web vitals for anyone who's not familiar with them. They have names, and we can talk about that as well. But to what extent is it important? I would, of course, say it's quite important. And it's not necessarily simple to pass all three, but that's sort of like, if you're passing core web vitals, then that's the threshold at which I would say you don't have an emergency. You don't have like a site speed problem. Back to your first question of how do you know when it's something I need to pay attention to? If you're failing core web vitals, then it's something you should pay attention to.
But an awful lot of sites fail core web vitals. In fact, most sites, as far as I can tell. I mean, in fact, we tried it's only recently we actually started. We on Magento, we found it almost impossible to pass. And we found it very hard to make any site speed improvements. And then we moved to Shopify, and we installed a core web vitals plugin, and we started to do an awful lot better. I think we're passing it on desktop, but not on mobile at the moment. So it seems to be that an awful lot. I mean, I don't know what proportion of sites pass core web vitals, but I'm guessing it's pretty low.
That's a good question. I bet there's someone's probably written a piece on this, on the ratio of sites that pass core web vitals and the relationship between which I've seen actually some pieces around, like this platform, this tool stack is more or less likely to pass core web vitals. There's certain metrics in there that are evolving over time. It's a relatively new, 2 years, we'll say, set of rules. And so first input delay is one of the metrics, for example, around how long it takes to respond when someone touches the glass or clicks a button. And that one, I rarely see brands fail. Almost all brands that I look at are passing that metric, and it's a bit of a low bar. And so some of these, there's talk about replacing that with a newer metric and tightening the threshold for passing and failing. But some of the other metrics are much more difficult to pass, like largest contentful paint, for example, is the time at which the hero element is drawn on the screen. And if you're a brand that's, the threshold here will say is 2.5 seconds. It is 2.5 seconds. We won't just say it. And if you've got, so something that has to happen before the largest contentful paint, for example, is the server has to respond with some data and say, show this on the screen. And if your server response time or your time to first byte or your backend time, all different words to say the same thing, if that's up around 2 seconds, then it's going to be really hard to paint that largest element in 2.5. So depending on how much control you have over the front end and back end, where the rendering is happening, if it's happening client side or server side, if you've got a caching layer in between or CDN, those can all have impacts on, that's sort of like I'm illustrating ways in which you could start to improve the Core Web Vitals score specifically for largest contentful paint. And then a lot of things that we focus on are early in the page load lifecycle. We're sort of dumping every asset to the phone or to the user. Like the HTML file that loads your homepage, for example, is going to request 20, 50, 100 other files. And the order in which those are loaded often doesn't get a ton of consideration other than like we try to move them up and down in the DOM and things like that, some classic practices. But usually what we see is third-party tags are coming in right away, or you've got like a plugin that's loading immediately. And there's things that are happening below the fold outside of the user's current viewport that are at odds with or competing with the above the fold content and getting things in front of the user as fast as possible. So to answer your question again, yeah, it is challenging to pass Core Web Vitals. Depending on your stack, how many tools you have plugged in, but there are strategies for nearly every brand. For every brand, for sure, there are strategies. We try to help at SpeedSense avoid a replatform. So use the stack you have, apply best practices. We don't need to throw the whole thing in the garbage necessarily, and just prioritize the tasks that'll have the biggest impact on your score across the whole site.
So how can a company or website owner decide if their speed issue is front end or back end?
There is a good question. Yeah, okay. So really, like, there's this first byte time that I just talked about. How long does it take until the server sends me something? So when your phone or device requests a page, it says like, get me the HTML, and the server receives that request. Depending on the architecture, we'll assume we're doing some server-side rendering right now. It queries the database for, okay, they're on the homepage, so we need this promotion, and they're logged in, so we need to get their cart, and we need to get their user account, and then we compile all that into an HTML asset and put that on the network back to the user. And then that'll arrive back to the device in a certain number of milliseconds. There's no way to have a healthy Core Web Vitals score, for example, if you've got like a 2 or 3 second backend time. You want that to be happening in under half a second, ideally. And so there's a few different milestones throughout the page load lifecycle. We're quite deep in the weeds now, but that's great. This is where I live. So back-end time, like how long until I got the first byte? How long until I've painted something to the screen? Is there anything that's blocking rendering completely? And then how long until I've painted the most relevant element? So those 3 milestones would be like time to first byte, first contentful paint, and largest contentful paint. And the relationship between those can help identify whether it's a front-end or back-end rendering issue and bottleneck.
Okay. So in terms of you're spending a lot of time on your website speed. I mean, how fast is enough? I mean, at what point do you think, wait a minute, this is diminishing returns. I should put our time into something else, or you've done enough?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, there's no reason to become the fastest site on the internet, and we have this discussion a lot of, a challenge that brands have in prioritizing site speed is when are we going to be done? Like, what's the success criteria here? And so generally we compare to a half dozen or so, or a dozen other competitors in your industry. So, we're talking e-commerce today. So unfortunately, Amazon, Walmart, the behemoths are sort of setting the bar for the expectation in the user's mind of how performant a site should be, how smooth an interaction should be. And I mean, unfortunately for the brand, because it can be challenging to compete with a behemoth with billions of dollars of dev resources, But fortunately for the user, I mean, we want to deliver as smooth a user experience as possible and make it free to browse and get what we need done online. So yeah, competitive analysis is the short answer there. Are you faster than your competitors? Are you at least in line with them? And then Core Web Vitals would be the other factor there. Are you passing Core Web Vitals? If those two are in good shape, like you're at the fast cohort, you're all green, then you don't have a problem.
Okay, so what's the relationship between website speed and conversion rate and user experience?
Sure. Yeah, great. We've one of the things that we do to help quantify when we're done as well is graph that relationship or model that relationship with our clients between the speed of the individual pages and the conversion rate for that given speed. So first, we'll just talk about site speed in general. When someone visits your page, if I were to visit, from Vancouver, a website that's hosted in London, I'd get a longer first byte time. If I'm on a slow network, I'm going to get a longer, slower experience than someone who's visiting on a 5G network on the newest CPU right next to the data center. And so performance in general is a distribution. Think of it just like a bell curve. It's got like some really fast sessions, some really slow sessions. And along that bell curve, then you can determine, okay, for the really fast sessions, what's the conversion rate there? Are they more or less likely to buy and than the users with a really slow session? And so we use data from the client site itself to map that relationship between fast and slow sessions and the likelihood of conversion at each point along that bell curve. And then we can identify, if we can shift this bell curve, say 100 milliseconds to the left, as in 100 milliseconds faster, what relationship will that have with conversion? So you can sort of forecast the lift based on moving that whole distribution of traffic. And then at some point, you can say, okay, so getting 100 milliseconds faster, we can estimate that that's going to be, 2 weeks of development effort. Maybe it's worth it, maybe it's not, depending on how much traffic you have, your AOV. But for sure, conversion rate and web performance are correlated strongly in that faster website equals better conversion. And actually, there's a point of diminishing returns to that point as well, because if you had the fastest website in the world, you're not exactly going to be, wooing people into opening up their wallets and just give me all your money. What we're really trying to address here is minimizing frustration, minimizing abandonment. It's sort of like stop them from leaving, stop annoying your customers, not delight them so much that they're like, oh, fine, I'll buy it because it's so fast.
So people don't up to a point. Is it just that people will care up to a point and not really beyond that point?
Yeah,
they're not thinking, oh, this is an amazing website. I'm not buying, not buying because they're going to think, oh, wow, this is the fastest site on the net. I'm just going to buy just because of that.
Yeah, I'm going to spend $3,000 more than I planned. Yeah, and also it gets prohibitively expensive to move the needle further and further to get faster and faster, and the ROI might not be positive after a certain amount.
So things like a lot of on platforms like Shopify, Magento, etc. You generally start off with a theme that you would purchase. Now, what would you recommend if someone's looking to buy a fast theme? How would you recommend analyzing it? Sure.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great one. There was a trend in the last 3 to 5 years of a lot of side rendered themes in that they're powered by JavaScript instead of rendered by the backend by the server. And you can build some really performant client-side, or you can build some really performant headless. So let me just talk about headless real quick here.
What is headless, first off?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, sort of helps answer this. Headless is the opposite. I mean, we'll describe what headed would be, if that's even a term, but it's client-side rendering. Server-side rendering would be the old school way to do it. So that description I just gave a few minutes ago of a request comes in for a page, the server fetches all the little widgets that it needs, compiles it into HTML, and sends it back to the device. That would be server-side rendering. The difficulty there is that it takes a long time for that server to build that page response and return it to the client. In a headless world, that rendering and all those requests are done not on the server, but on the device or somewhere in the cloud in an intermediate API. And so that architecture doesn't have your e-commerce platform as the primary point of coordination, we'll say, of where pages are built. You interact with the e-commerce platform via an API and say, get me the quantity of items in the cart, and then the device has already built the page and can render the cart asynchronously. Mm-hmm. So one of the gotchas, I guess, that I'd watch out for is a completely client-side rendered site or template or theme. So taking that all the way, there's the worst case scenario for performance in a headless site or in a theme that's built in pure JavaScript, is when all of that rendering is done on the client. Now instead of the server responding with HTML that the client can render, it responds with a bunch of JavaScript files, which is in essence an application. The device needs to boot that application and start drawing the elements to the screen. So you can have really fast time to first byte, like I mentioned a minute ago. Maybe that's 200 milliseconds or so, because it's just like, here, take the app and boot it. But then you might have a really long 2 or 3 second time to first paint, or first contentful paint time. So that's a scenario where you've got a lot of render blocking JS, and the client device, which is very underpowered usually compared to a server, is churning through files to build the DOM, to render that to the screen, to apply CSS. And so for most people, I would say I would look for a classical, like, server-side rendered HTML, depending on the size of your site and depending on the direction of your brand. If you're looking to build like really deeply integrated content with shopping elements throughout, that'll be when you start looking at a headless site. Like, maybe we're going to do a content play and it happens to have shopping interspersed through it. It's different than saying, like, we're going to build a storefront. So the architectural stack and a theme decision, I think, needs to depend on your business strategy and the kind of company you're building.
Okay, but if you're say a small company and you've got like go into a theme store and you want to, there's all these sites saying this the fastest theme on Shopify, how would you know what to look for? Yeah,
that's a challenge for sure. A reference implementation is always nice. Like if they've usually got a demo and you could run that through pagespeed.web.dev, the core web vital scan, and see, is it passing? Does it have, they're likely not going to have much real user data because there's not significant enough traffic to expose that. Yeah, I should just clarify that for a second. If you go into Core Web Vital or into PageSpeed Insights and put your URL in and it says no data for real users, Google is only really exposing that when there's an appreciable amount of traffic on your website, because it takes some statistical significance to confidently say, this is how much traffic you're getting. But yeah, still, I would run a PageSpeed scan, a Lighthouse scan on the template itself, on the reference implementation or like the demo storefront, and see, is it green? Is it heinous in some way? Mm-hmm. That's my recommendation.
Okay. So, you talked about headless. What is AMP is another thing. What is AMP, and how does it affect site speed?
Yeah, AMP stands for Accelerated Mobile Pages, and it was an initiative that Google had about 7 or 8 years ago. It's sort of falling out of favor for things like full responsive. I think let's rewind a little here to mobile first web development and responsive web development. There was a time where you'd build a separate store or a separate site, regardless of whether it's e-commerce or not, for mobile, like Shawn.com, or tablet or desktop, www. And those were hard to maintain. So you'd have 3 separate sets of templates for 3 different client devices. Over time, that evolved into responsive web. So you've got a fluid set of templates that operates across all device classes. And that with it brought some challenges. Now we're like delivering high resolution images to phones and video and, a lot of JavaScript to, over at the time, 3G networks to very underpowered devices. And so AMP was sort of a response to that. It's like, we need to build a way to get the minimum viable page to to mobile devices as quickly as possible. And the idea was that it would load instantly from the Google cache, as in Google would host these AMP pages. But again, it was sort of a deviation away from unifying templates, because you'd have to build a separate set of AMP templates, which required more maintenance. And currently, I don't see a ton of brands building on it now, but there's a few where we come in and we've seen they've had an AMP implementation and now want to make their mobile variant of their responsive site as fast as the AMP variant was.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, so you think that AMP is probably not something that people need to, is not the thing they should be looking at these days. It's a more historical thing. Okay.
I agree. Yeah.
So what is the fastest platform? Is that how long is a bit of a string question? So you've got things like, a lot of the out of the box things like Shopify and BigCommerce, and then I suppose and then you've got things like Magento. What is your platform of choice in terms of speed?
Sure. Yeah. I think any platform is more than up to task to deliver a performant experience. And generally we burn ourselves on the stove by adding a lot of other plugins, third-party tags. So I would say the fastest, like I'm going to go back to my Craigslist example, the fastest in terms of performance isn't necessarily the most engaging. It's pure HTML, no CSS, no JavaScript would be the fastest, but no one ought to build a page like that, because you're not going to build a very engaging experience. And often, when I was a developer, I come from a developer background. I'd led dev teams and things like that. And performance has always been very important to me. And I was much more staunch about, no, we can't put a huge image above the fold on the homepage. It's going to be so slow. And now I've softened my stance, obviously, to realize that there's always a trade-off here between a beautiful, engaging, inspiring, exciting experience and a fast one. And so there's often these two goals are at odds of delivering, excitement and stoke versus quick and responsive. And so the balance is make it exciting enough to be fast at the same time. I don't have a plug directly to answer your question about which platform is the fastest. I think any can be made quite quick with the right practices and the right tools.
So what is the best? I mean, how do you design an engaging experience whilst keeping up to, while having a fast website? What is it? What are your, I don't know, top 5 tips on how to do this?
Top 5 tips. All right. Prioritize things that are the primary reason that page exists. So say it's your product detail page. And you've got, why is there a product detail page? It's to show the person the product and to help them make a selection. So what is the imagery? What are the descriptions? And then allow them to select it. Some secondary objectives of the product detail page would be like, answer their questions, allow people to ask questions about the product, user reviews, user-generated content, Instagram feed, like further down. And so a lot of times we'll see, for example, like your third-party reviews widget loaded before you even load, or at the same time as, in terms of the browser's mind, before you even load the hero main product image. And so the general recommendation here is get the first-party primary use case in front of the user as quickly as you can, and defer or lazy load the execution of other accessory or secondary data. Does that answer your question there? Did you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So imagining you've got like a bunch of reviews, that's a good use case, because often those are not something that the brand stores themselves. It's a third-party plugin like Bazaar Voice or something like that. And so deferring the execution of that, by defer, I mean specifically the word defer in your JavaScript tag. There's a few different ways to load JS files. One would be just put the script tag in your HTML. And when that's encountered, I'll take it a little aside here and explain loading JavaScript. When you encounter a script tag, or when the browser encounters it during constructing the DOM, it pauses parsing the DOM, it pauses building the DOM, downloads that script, executes it, determines whether it needs to be influencing the DOM that's currently building, and then continues on its way. So if you put, a third-party tag that's maybe it's just like a remarketing tag, something that's not even visual, halfway down the page, then the browser is going to stop doing what it was doing and go and fetch that and render it, or parse it and execute it. The next and most common and most familiar for most people way to load JS is asynchronously. So the async tag, same idea. You just put the word async in the script tag. In this scenario, the browser will encounter that script. It'll no longer stop parsing to load it. It'll load it asynchronously, but once it has continued, or once it's completed the download, it'll still execute that script. It'll stop parsing DOM, execute the script, and run it. And that can, again, interrupt whatever else it was doing. So browsers are single threaded. And so if it's trying to render your hero image or build a carousel for the home, above the fold, then, not typically, I would say don't put a carousel above the fold on your homepage.
Okay.
In particular. So the most performant way to load a third-party script would be with a defer tag. And defer then takes that one step further. So it won't interrupt the browser in parsing DOM for the download, and it also won't interrupt it once it arrives. It'll wait until the DOM has been built and then execute that script.
So you keep saying the word DOM. What does that mean?
Sorry about that. Yep. DOM is a document object model. So you've got HTML files to build a page and the CSS files. And these two things together contain a bunch of nodes, we'll say. And these nodes build up a render tree. So, this is, let's try to explain it like I'm not talking to who's someone who's as nerdy as me about this. Imagine like every little square on your screen is a DOM element. And the DOM is basically like the skeleton behind the scenes, the blueprint for the page.
Okay, so was that your first point as well? So I'm trying to get five tips here. So are we still on one? Have we finished one?
Number one is sort of a sweeping. Sure, yeah, we'll call that number one. Number two would be preload your LCP image. So if you've got a largest contentful paint element, like your hero image on your homepage, your product shot on the PDPs, you can preload those. So you can tell the browser, look, this is the most important element. And a lot of web performance comes down to giving the browser some hints as to what's important and what's not needed right away. Like we're still going to tell it, these are the 100 files that make up this page, but which of those should I get immediately? And so there's the ability to preload that LCP element. You can put it in the head of the browser even, or the head of the page, and it'll be fetched right away. And then by the time the DOM tree has constructed the node that contains that element, it'll already be in cache on the browser, so it'll render a lot faster. That's number two. Number three, I would say third-party tags in your search, in your tag manager can play havoc at times. Tag managers are incredibly powerful in that you can deploy code to your site instantly, more or less. But there's a bit of I don't like the word pixel, and it's evolved over time to be like, it's just a tracking pixel. It's an innocuous little 1x1 pixel. But often those are full JavaScript files, which are fetched from a third party and executed as soon as they load. And that is all coming at the expense of often other parts of your experience that you want to prioritize. So attribution, a lot of times we talk about attribution in tag management, like it's usually third parties or remarketing or some ads, some tracking. And anyone who's tried to increase traffic and sales on their site has been sold a direct relationship between, this is causal and this our product will result in X revenue lift. And here I am doing the same for site speed. But every script wants to be loaded immediately so that early in the page load lifecycle, imagine it takes 5 seconds to run all the scripts that load on your page. If the user leaves within 3 and this remarketing script wouldn't have fired until the 4th second, then they're never going to capture that visit. So we're at odds here around like, what is more important, the user seeing the right page or tracking that the user has seen that page and telling and reporting that back to AdWords, for example. So I would say take the recommendations of put it in your head tag, load it immediately with a grain of salt, because that is going to come with a performance impact. So that'll be number 3. Let's see, the top 5. Image size. We'll keep going. This is fun. Yeah, image sizes. I mean, that's often the first thing people think of is compress your images properly. And I would say no image on the web should be above like 300K. There's no reason to have like 2 and 3 and 4 or 5 megabyte homepage or product shots. There are third-party plugins or third-party DNS services that allow you to dynamically resize images based on the user's device that's visiting them. So one thing that I guess Responsive introduced a few years ago was, whoa, now we've got to make an image size for mobile. We've got to make one for tablet. We've got to make one for desktop. And so there's a lot of like cropping and resizing in your DAM or CMS. And so there's some nice tooling that's evolved over the last couple of years that allows you to put one huge like 4K really rich image in your CMS, and then an intermediate piece of software. ImageX is one that I've used, for example, that I quite like. There's a few that we've used. Adobe Scene 7 does something similar. There's a dozen different services that do this, but the device will request an image with the right pixel ratio, so it's a Retina display, and the right size, the right dimensions, so that you're not delivering this huge 4K asset to a tiny little handheld screen. So that's a good win. Let's see, top 5, last one.
You talked about okay, so can you give me an example of you talk about speed a lot. What about engaging experience? What about more kind of, is it just size speed you work with, or what about a tip for more kind of usability based tip?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk less then about the loading experience and more about afterload, animation. And anytime you've got like something moving on screen. So I'll give a good example here. We've got a client who had a category page that displayed about 300 products. And every time you'd like filter or sort that category page, every one of those 300 elements was supposed to beautifully animate into the new position. When the old ones get removed, they all sort of slide. So it's like a really nice tiled experience. But this isn't part of the page load lifecycle. This is happening well after, the DOM is built and the network is quiet and the CPU is quiet. And then the user hits like, I just want to see the red ones. So what the CPU is attempting to do there is for each of these 300 tiles, recalculate the current position and the final destination position of where it's going to be, and set up a set of frames to draw the animation of it moving from here to there. And trying to do that for 300 products on a tiny little CPU, it was impossible. So what ended up happening was everything would just snap to place, but it would be like, 300 or 400, maybe half a second later. 300 or 400 milliseconds, I was going to say there. Maybe multiple seconds, actually, for some of these devices and categories. And so what our recommendation was just stop trying to make this animation. Like, I get what you're going for. It would be beautiful, but trying to do 60 FPS for 300 products on like a phone that, 95% of these products were below the fold and off screen anyway. And so we're still calculating frames and XY position and trying to draw all that. But yeah, there's ways you can try to build a beautiful experience, but then in practice or applied, it doesn't really pan out the same way. So that, I guess, would be my third or my final recommendation is keep frame rate high. And there's ways to track that with Chrome's dev tools. Frame rate ought to be 60 FPS ideally, but that's a hard bar to hit.
So look, I've got a final question for you. I like to ask a fluffy question in the end. Look, you're clearly pretty nerdy about site speed. What else are you nerdy about? Not e-commerce related.
Yeah. I'm glad you picked up on the nerdy site speed thing. Yeah.
No, you proved your nerdiness. That's not in question.
got my badge.
There's no question in my mind that you're nerdy about this. You know your stuff.
Cycling for sure. Like I'm really into all kinds of biking. Just
off-road, on-road.
Yeah, a little bit of everything. I just got a new wheel set. Actually, you're in the UK. I just ordered a new wheel set from Hunt, which is a UK brand, and just love to road ride. Like I live in Vancouver. It's beautiful here, so we get amazing road riding. And I'm also going to Whistler this weekend to do some downhill mountain biking. So I'm at the point in my life where I'm going to need a lot more equipment than I did when I was 25 or so.
So have you got like a big helmet with the downhill? Is it you got the huge great front fork suspension and the huge great
full
helmet
suspension. Yeah, even the bikes, like they're designed not to be able to climb. They're uncomfortable to ride even on the flat. Like the seat is so far back, your weight is so far back. It's full downhill, like chest and knee and arm protectors, and Whistler Bike Park is incredible. So
okay, have you ever done yourself any damage doing that?
Yeah, I broke my collarbone. Collarbone's like the classic cyclist injury because you fall on an outstretched limb. Yeah, there's a few. Yeah. So that's why I'm getting all this armor this time around.
Okay. Well, if you ever find yourself in the UK, there's a place called Bike Park Wales, which is probably not as
This is like the ultimate
as Whistler.
Have you heard of the types of fun?
Yeah, it's
three types of fun. This is type 1 fun, where it's fun the whole time. Anything lift serviced is type 1 fun. Type 2 fun is like there's some hard part to it, like climbing and to get to descents. That sounds like what you're talking about, and I also really love that.
There is an uplift. There's not a lift, but it's a van. You can pay for a van to take you to the top.
Oh,
not very glamorous, but it works.
Oh, that's even better. Yeah, I like the rough, sort of scrappy nature of that lift.
What's it? So it's type 1 fun, type 2 fun. Is it type 3 fun?
Yeah, type 3 fun is you usually set out to find some type 2, but something goes wrong, and
none of it's fun.
Yeah. For type 2, you're glad you did it. Yeah, type 3 was like it was dangerous. Yeah, type 3, I don't think you're glad you did it. I think it's like there's a good article about this written by I don't remember, some like backcountry club in the US. Yeah, type 3 is like, we wish we'd never done it. It was never fun. And that was a mistake.
No, I've learned something. Look, it's been great talking to you, Shawn. And it's, tell us your site again. What's your website?
Speedsense.com.
Okay, great. It's been lovely speaking to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Trevor. Yeah, it was fun.
Bye-bye.